Welcome, everyone. My name is Kira Bradford, and I am co-PI and technical lead of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the 8th installment in our Fresh Fair webinar series. Today's webinar is called De-Identification, Protecting the Identities of HEAL's Superheroes, and will focus on describing methods and approaches for de-identifying subjects and hearing from representatives of 3 HEAL-funded studies. This webinar will consist of a brief presentation, followed by a moderated panel discussion, and then a live Q&A. And if at any point you have a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box. We are joined today by Emily Dressler of Pain ERN, Bettina Hoeppner of COARs, and Emily Smith of NRN. Emily Dressler, PhD, is an associate professor and vice chair in the Department of Biostatistics and Data Science at Wake Forest School of Medicine. She's the lead biostatistician with the WFNCI Community Oncology Research Program, or NCORR, research base. She earned her PhD in the Division of Biostatistics at the Medical University of South Carolina, and her primary research interest is in clinical trials. She has expertise in adaptive phase 1 trial designs, such as the continual reassessment method, and has developed methods that incorporate ordinal toxicity grading and mixed toxicity efficacy outcomes. Dressler has over 10 years of experience overseeing statistical and data considerations for trials, including study design, monitoring, data intake management, and analyses. Also with us today is Bettina Hoeppner, PhD, MS, and she is an associate professor in psychology at Harvard Medical School and an associate director of research of the MGH Recovery Research Institute at Massachusetts General Hospital, and statistician of MGH Clinical Trials Network and Institute. She is an experimental psychologist with research interests in mHealth technologies, smoking cessation, and engagement in auxiliary addiction services, for example, mutual help recovery community centers, where she frequently uses mixed method approaches to inform treatment development and engagement with existing resources. She earned her 2 master's degree and PhD from the University of Rhode Island. Also with us here today is Emily Smith. Emily Smith is a research systems programmer and analyst in the Center for Clinical Research Informatics at RTI International. She has more than 10 years of experience managing epidemiologic studies and conducting data management and reporting. Emily Smith leads data management teams through study startup, data collection, and study closeout, directing activities such as data monitoring, programming, and processing, development of data quality checks, and development of reporting techniques to improve study data quality. As a SAS programmer, she is experienced in developing macros and reusable system code that can be easily applied to new projects for items like, but not limited to, data download and processing, reporting, and standardization for public use data sets. She has assisted in the de-identification of public use datasets for multiple trials in the Neonatal Research Network, NRN, for which RTI serves as the Data Coordinating Center. And last but not least, leading us through the webinar today is HEAL steward Steve Erickson. Steve is a PhD and is a senior research statistician in RTI International's Genomics, Bioinformatics, and Translational, also known as GOBOT, Research Center. He has been developing analytical methods for high-dimensional biological data and researching the etiology of complex human disease since 2004. And he has performed studies of gene expression, microRNAs, copy number variation, site-specific DNA methylation patterns, single nucleotide polymorphisms in candidate genes, and genome-wide association studies. Through his research, he has advanced the understanding of the multifactorial causes of non-syndromic birth defects, including conotruncal and obstructive congenital heart defects, and has collaborated with a broad range of biomedical investigators. With that, I will now pass it over to Steve to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Kira. Our objectives for this webinar are first to define precisely what we mean by de-identification. Next, I'll introduce HIPAA and its de-identification standard. Specifically, we'll discuss 2 HIPAA-recognized methods for de-identification, which are expert determination and safe harbor. Then I'll discuss some factors in health data which contribute to being able to identify subjects by linking to external data sources. I'll finish my piece of the agenda with some examples of how de-identification works in practice. I'll discuss multiple strategies for mitigating identification risk, and also point out a very nice online resource that can be very helpful while you prepare to submit your HEAL data to a repository. Then we'll open up the floor to a Q&A session with our panelists. But before diving into this material, one thing I'd like to really emphasize is that it is indeed a challenge to maintain the confidentiality of study participants while retaining the utility of data that we share with the scientific community. What I hope we can demonstrate is that there's an abundance of methods, resources, and tools that can help investigators retain the richness of the data they share while keeping study participants anonymous. So, what precisely do we mean by de-identification? The US Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, defines de-identification as follows, and I'm just quoting directly. The process of de-identification by which identifiers are removed from the health information mitigates privacy risks to individuals and thereby supports the secondary use of data for comparative effectiveness studies, policy assessment, life sciences research, and other endeavors. I really like this language because it emphasizes that de-identification supports data sharing precisely because it mitigates privacy risks. You don't get one without the other. Now that defines de-identification sort of in the abstract sense. So let's dive into a couple examples. We'll start with an example of weak de-identification. So this is a still from the 1978 Superman film with Christopher Reeve in the title role. As many of you probably know, Superman kept his true identity as Daily Planet reporter Clark Kent a highly guarded secret, and he used a very simple but allegedly effective way of obscuring his identity. And that's specifically that he wore a pair of glasses and parted his hair on the other side. Personally, I think it really stretches the imagination. I mean, even Lois Lane couldn't figure out that Clark Kent and Superman were the same person. And of course, nowadays, even the most like rudimentary facial recognition program would easily, link the two. Anyway, next, we'll show an example of slightly better de-identification. And here we have a still from the 1960s Batman television series. And we see that both Batman and Robin have covered parts of their faces. So let's discuss. The Batman costume does hide certain facial features, but still reveals important identifiers like his eyes, mouth, and jaw. And perhaps even more important, Bruce Wayne and Batman are both prominent public figures in Gotham City. There's a genuine risk that a person could use external data sources like newspaper clippings or police reports to infer that they're the same person. And then third, we have another example in Spider-Man. And in this case, the costume covers Peter Parker from head to toe. So just I will rhetorically pose this question: would this outfit satisfy HIPAA's privacy standards? Well, we should figure out what those privacy standards are. And yes, it is the privacy rule of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, better known as HIPAA, which provides our standard for de-identification. Under this privacy rule, health information is considered de-identified. And Kira, could you move the slide forward? Oh, I'm sorry, I've moved ahead. Anyway, under the privacy rule, health information is considered de-identified if one, it does not identify an individual, and two, the entity covered by HIPAA has no reasonable basis to believe it can be used to identify an individual. I'm sorry, now it's a new slide, my bad. So furthermore, HIPAA recognizes two distinct methods for de-identification. And we're going to cover safe harbor first because it's the more straightforward method. And so safe harbor simply involves removing 18 types of identifiers from data pertaining to any individual, plus any relatives, employers, and household members. So these 18 identifiers include a lot of what you'd expect: names, telephone numbers, email addresses, vehicle IDs, social security numbers, etc. Safe harbor also disallows any elements of dates more specific than the year. In terms of geography, only the first 3 digits of a zip code are allowed, and then only if the resulting geographic area contains more than 20,000 people. Another requirement for safe harbor is that the entity must not have actual knowledge that the information could be used either alone or in combination with other data to identify an individual. And that phrase, actual knowledge, essentially means that the entity is responsible for known risks, but not for hypothesizing every possible scenario under which a person could be identified. Safe harbor is pretty straightforward to implement for structured tabular data, for which you have a good data dictionary. However, those restrictions on geographic data and dates could seriously limit that data set's utility for research. The other method is called expert determination, and it requires that an expert with the appropriate knowledge and experience applies generally accepted statistical and scientific principles and determines that identification risk is very small and documents their methods and the results of that analysis. Ideally, expert determination should maximize the utility of the de-identified data set. It's applicable to a much broader range of data sets than safe harbor. And finally, that very small risk standard is substantially stronger than the no actual knowledge standard of safe harbor. However, it requires an expert. It's complex and labor intensive, and it takes a fair amount of subjective judgment. Now, under both methods, there are 3 important factors to consider when evaluating the risk of identifying a person by linking to external data sources. First is replicability, which refers to how consistently a value occurs in relationship to an individual. For example, a patient's blood glucose level will vary from test to test and therefore has low replicability. But on the other hand, demographic variables are much more stable over time and therefore they represent a much higher risk. Next is data source availability. And so carrying forward the previous example, results of lab tests are not typically disclosed beyond the healthcare environment, while demographic information can be sourced from public records such as birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage licenses. And the last factor is distinguishability, which means how closely an individual could be distinguished in the health data. So for an example, if you take a combination of a person's year of birth, gender, and the first 3 digits of zip code, that's going to be unique to that individual for less than 0.1% of US residents. Now, on the other hand, if you take the combination of the date of birth, gender, and the full zip code, that's unique for over half of US residents. So that's why distinguishability is a very important factor to consider. So next we'll look at an illustration of how age, zip code, and gender could be used to link patient data to voter registration records. On the left side, imagine that this is a data set being considered for submission to a data repository. And on the right are voter registration records. In this example, 3 out of the 4 records can be linked to this public data set. And the only reason that the 15-year-old male couldn't be linked is because he's too young to vote. So next, we're going to carry this example forward and discuss multiple risk mitigation strategies and how those strategies can be implemented in practice. So here's that same example data set. How could we mitigate the risk of identification while still retaining features of the data that might serve research purposes? The first strategy is suppression of data elements. So for example, an age of 91 combined with other demographic data could be highly identifying. Similarly, a very low age combined with a rare medical diagnosis, or on the other hand, an especially prominent person with a rare diagnosis could also be identifying. And the suppression strategy is simply to remove those specific data elements, and they're shaded in this example table. Next, we see an example of generalization. In this example, age is binned into large groups, and the 5th digit of zip code is suppressed. This greatly reduces the distinguishability of this data set. And so finally, an alternative to generalization is randomly perturbing data. In this case, specific values are replaced with equally specific but different values that are randomly generated. And this strategy is often preferred to generalization because if it's properly implemented, certain statistical properties in the original data set, for example, mean, variance, covariance, would be maintained in this perturbed data set. Okay, so I'm getting toward the end of my comments, but before wrapping up, one resource I'd like to point out is housed on the Johns Hopkins Library's website. And they have an extensive list of applications and tools to assist in de-identification. As you can see, they've divided these resources into different sections. One for unstructured text, one for digital images, and finally one for sort of tabular / structured data. We've included the URL both in the chat and also in a list of resources at the end of the slide deck. And the slide deck is going to be available to all registrants after the webinar is completed. So we can take the information that I've presented and create sort of a checklist for investigators and sort of recommend that people take these steps. And the first one obviously is sort of become more familiar with the real specifics of the HIPAA de-identification standards. Next, early in the research process, identify the person on your team who would be primarily responsible for ensuring robust de-identification. If the identity of that person isn't obvious, or it doesn't seem like someone on your team would be sort of suited for that, it'd be a good idea to start looking sooner rather than later. Decide whether safe harbor or expert determination is more appropriate for your data. Then identify which data fields represent the greatest risk. And finally, do your research, search, and see if there's any existing tools that would meet your needs. So in summary and in closing, I'd like to emphasize a few takeaway messages. First, there is a genuine tension between data utility and identification risk, but participant privacy is paramount. And in fact, participant privacy is what allows data sharing at all. Also, safe harbor de-identification more often than not would reduce the research utility of a data set. So if you have in your mind like, oh, well, that'd be the simplest thing to do, obviously we would do that, it might be worth reconsidering. Now that the last two items are related to each other, and so the third item is that, whatever challenges you have with your particular data sets, it's probably not entirely novel. And indeed, there's an entire host of software tools already available to aid in de-identifying different types of data. So, so it might seem as though you're dealing with a situation that's completely novel and challenging, but somebody else has probably dealt with the same kind of situation. Okay, so now we're going to invite our three panelists to join us, and I'll ask them to please turn on their cameras, and we can move into the question and answer panel portion of the webinar. So my first question I'm going to pose initially to Emily Smith. And the question is, I gave one resource for de-identifying data. Do you have any go-to resources for de-identification of data?
Sure. So I will say with the caveat that the data that I typically work with is we don't receive PII. So usually when de-identifying data, I'm doing the expert determination method rather than the safe harbor method. But I think one of the best resources are the actual repository guidelines that you're using. So you'll likely select a repository with your PI. And so use that in conjunction with whoever the primary data manager or statistician is to determine how to de-identify that.
Excellent. And can I ask the same question of Emily Dressler?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I would say that is a great first start. And if you don't have a repository that you're currently using or you're unclear, how to get started, I like to look for similar studies, whether it's in trials or in the disease topic that you're working in, to kind of see what other people have put out there in terms of how they de-identify and kind of look at what the other mechanisms are doing. Also, if you're working with a large group of people, many people have experience doing this on other studies. And so we work in our team and kind of bounce ideas off of each other and take a first stab at it, and then walk down the hall or jump on a Zoom and say, hey, does this make sense? Or am I missing anything? So having an extra set of eyes kind of double checking helps as well.
Can I ask a related question about this? And that's the question of which repository you would choose to put your data. Is that ever a question that you have in a particular study?
Yeah, I mean, usually we say we're going to follow our guidelines. So like Kira said, I work with the NCORE research base. We have a repository that we're required by NCI to deposit data in. If you're working on clinical trials, you have to deposit some data and results in clinicaltrials.gov. I know there's different genomic databases, maybe not if you're working in Alzheimer's, but cancer. So I guess that's kind of my suggestion is, if you're feeling stuck, you can just start kind of Googling repositories for similar areas and you might get pointed in the right direction.
Okay, great. Are there any recommended tools that any of you might recommend for de-identification of data? I'm going to pose this to Emily Dressler.
Sure. So, I mean, we use SAS and R for analytic programs at Wake Forest, and we can easily remove variables and different things to manipulate the data and strip codes, and if we need to do that. But I also spend a lot of time in REDCap which many organizations have as a free tool that we use our data capture. That's how we capture our trial data. And there are ways to export data de-identified through there, and you can actually specify which variables you're concerned about, and they will go ahead and do that. They will also do the data, I forget what you called it, Steve, you know, where they move the dates or whatever. There's options for that too in REDCap. So there are, even if you're not working in REDCap, just kind of seeing what some of the things that they do could be helpful to learn from and use in your own studies.
That's great. So REDCap, it just has a lot of functionality sort of built into it for lots of things. Bettina, I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Do you have any like preferred piece of software or method when you're preparing to share something to a repository?
So really want to echo what Emily just said. You know, I love REDCap as well. And we use that for a lot because it's such great functionality, and it really lets you be in touch with your data and understand how it was entered and how it looks in the end. So that's great. I also really like the point about asking others, you know, don't do it on your own and try to make all the decisions, but really reality checking. And reality checking with your statistical colleagues is wonderful. Also reality check with the other people involved in the study who are not as data savvy and not as much in the trenches as you are. And, you know, just doing simple lists in Excel to say, these are the kinds of variables I flagged that I think things we should talk about and consider and what we should do about them, and make it accessible to bring your non-statistical team members into the discussion so that they can highlight things that you might have missed otherwise and vice versa. So very much echoing what Emily just said.
Excellent, excellent. And Emily Smith, is there any tool or software program that wasn't mentioned that?
Not that wasn't mentioned. It was mentioned that I'm a SAS programmer in my intro. So I generally use SAS. And for multiple NRN studies, we've used the same repository. So I've been able to create things like macros that can be reused across studies, which is nice.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so next question for the panel is, do you ever share data that is not de-identified? Emily?
Sure, I'll start. So yes, I do. But you have to make sure that the correct people are on the IRB. And you also have to make sure that you consented your participants in the right way so that they understand that that's a possibility. There's times that we really can't de-identify completely, especially if we're talking about qualitative data sets. And maybe if we're working with PIs in a study and they really do need to see some of this information to understand if there's a safety concern. So again, they would be listed as part of the IRB, but there's times we have to get other experts involved, and we just have to make sure that that's part of the study design up front.
Excellent, excellent. Bettina, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just adding also the use of the data use agreements, and you get very specific requests. So it's different from, you know, taking a data set and making publicly available in a repository versus a very specific team that has a very specific question. It is all the training and guidance and so forth, and where you really spell out what they will do and how they will present the data. That's another thing to do.
Great, great. So I'm going to ask kind of a sort of a general question to the panel next. And that's if there are some unique challenges that you have had associated with de-identifying data and how you handled that.
I can start. I mean, overall, it's a very time-consuming process and requires a lot of attention to detail. You really need to look at and scrutinize the distribution of every variable and document any changes that you've made to the data set, like where observations were suppressed and why. And I've run across working with a pretty small study sample. So in that example, I didn't strictly adhere to the repository's guidelines in terms of cut off the outliers at this point. And I had to work with the senior statistician on the project who was very familiar with the data, as well as the PI, to determine which outliers would be allowable and not also risk re-identification, to also maintain a more robust data set.
Bettina or Emily Dressler, any comments on that?
So I'll echo what Emily Smith said, that it's not trivial to de-identify data. There's a lot of thought. I mean, the easy things like taking out name, that's pretty straightforward. It's where you get into the other issues, especially if you're working with vulnerable populations or small groups where there aren't as many of them. So you have to worry about identifying information there. So I think talking about it as a study team and making sure the study team is comfortable, similar to what Bettina said, makes the statistician's job a whole lot easier. You know, I can sit and code it real quick if we're all in agreement in terms of what it is that we want to do with it. So having those discussions up front and knowing that it's not going to just be a checkbox at the end of the day is helpful.
Excellent.
And I will add to that one of those tricky variables is dates and times and so forth. And I think that's a variable that we all will have to think more carefully about as we move forward. We have ecological momentary assessments, we have variables, we have all kinds of streams of data now coming in. So being mindful about how we handle those data is going to be something I think the field is going to grapple with, and we'll have much better guidance on it. But we're, oftentimes we're going to be in a position where we have to think about it ourselves. And again, consult with colleagues. Don't worry on your own. To work through those kinds of questions.
I'm going to ask it sort of an off-the-cuff question. So the guidelines, the HIPAA guidelines were crafted back in, I should remember the year, it was 2000, when I mean, it was drafted a long time ago, before this era of big data, machine learning, massive data sets that are being collected by large companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just curious if you might have any thoughts on sort of like how that changes our practice or the way we view these problems at all.
Not quite sure where you're going with it, Steve, except that big data can still be identified. Is that what you mean?
Or what I'm saying is there are these large data sets that are owned by companies, and so we can't necessarily. Do we need to be aware of like sort of what might exist in the private realm?
I always try to think about the end user in mind. I actually just gave a panel discussion about this in implementation science, and I'm a biostatistician, so I think on the front end, how do I get my data set ready and spit it out to people? Because that's what you have to do. But what are people going to do with it? And how could it be used? And how is it helpful? And if we think about those items, then we have a different question that we can really start thinking about. And so, is the private data available? It could be, but what are we going to do with it? And how would we synergize that information and use that information? And so it's not just about having it de-identified, but it's also thinking about how we can use this and what's the purpose of using it in the future. It's not an easy question. It's something that I think everyone is struggling with right now. And there is a push that more data out there is better. And I would agree, as long as we have standards and people really understand the context at what they're looking at and the limitations of what they can and cannot do with that data.
And I think I also want to add on that and go back to that actual knowledge phrase you used earlier, Steve. I think that's critical. I don't think we will know everything that exists out in the world. And especially with the variables, we as scientists will know this person was using an EMA device during these days. But of course, the company who produced our variable will also know the device number in which something was connected. So it's possibly feasibly that they can connect those dots, which is why it becomes challenging to share this kinds of information. But we need to go with what we have actual knowledge of, and share them with teams. It's different sharing with a team that what they're going to use the data for versus putting that kind of fine-grained level data available publicly, where anybody could grab it and you don't know what they're going to use it for.
That's great. Thanks. I'm sorry. It is a bit of a conjectural question. So returning sort of back to the nuts and bolts of things, are there scenarios when you would not de-identify a data set?
Yes, there are. There are minority and underserved populations that we really need to have additional considerations for that might not be comfortable sharing their data, or might feel like their data could be used in a jeopardizing way. I know especially the American Indian communities believe that the data is owned by them. And so you have to have very special data use agreements with studies that involve American Indian participants. And again, the big theme here is those discussions have to happen up front, or you can't do anything about it on the back end. I work in implementation science. Sometimes some of my studies really deal with provider level data, stakeholder, and even site level data, which when you're dealing with a trial that has 10 sites, it might be hard to do that in any way that isn't going to explicitly identify them. And so we have to have those conversations with the sites, talk about what they're comfortable sharing or not sharing, and give them options to opt in or opt out. And again, yes, that's a limitation when we're talking about de-identifying data, that you're going to lose some information. But you have to think of the context of what you're sharing it to. And if it's going to be just out there for the whole world to see, perhaps that de-identification is necessary. And if it's for a very small group that's using it in a different way, sometimes those discussions can be handled and talked through with the data ownership people and still get to the same point. So there's not a one size fits all for this, unfortunately. I think it really depends on who you're sharing it to, what modality you're sharing it to, and what are some of the fine details of the people and the types of data that you're getting.
Excellent. Bettina or Emily Smith, did you have anything to add to that question?
I don't think so. I think you summed it up greatly. I guess I would just add that also on the data input level, to just raising awareness around it, especially you mentioned, different sites of different sizes. For smaller sizes, things become a lot more identifiable, and just reminding the people early in the data collection end about the importance of keeping the data safe and how they have a much more risky environment in that sense.
Excellent. Kira, did you have anything to add or say?
Yeah, I will just say we have been getting a number of live questions coming in through the Q&A box. So I would like us to move forward from the moderated panel discussion into the live Q&A portion.
Fantastic. And I am seeing a question from the live Q&A, and it says, the other requirement for safe harbor is that the entity must not have actual knowledge that the information could be used alone or in combination with other data to identify an individual. And that phrase, alone or in combination, can you explicate that? And I would say that example where we see the health data that is being linked to voter registration, I mean, that's a bit of a toy example, right? It's kind of obvious, but nonetheless, it illustrates how there's publicly available data that identifies people. I mean, like the public record, house ownership, what car you own, things like that. And so we have to be cognizant of how we can link putatively de-identified data and leverage them against stuff that's out there and widely available. I don't know if anyone else on the panel had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have voter registration, we have death records, we have tax records. There's a lot out there. So you have to really think about what are those identifying pieces of information that you would see across those that you would definitely not want in there. And I do think we have to think extra special about young people and keeping those things de-identified, and also again those minority groups where the numbers start to get small in areas. You know, if you're in a predominantly white county and you put information in about one or two minorities, it may not be all that hard to track back to who they might be. So it's when you get into those small numbers that you start to worry that it could be identified.
Any other comments on that from the panel? Okay, why don't we move on to question 2 from the audience. And question 2 asks, tool existence and tool acceptance are two different things. What governance concerns are there related to these issues? For instance, the use of Amazon's recognition platform to identify PHI in burned-in images. An organization needs to accept those tools. So how do we get to acceptance? I'm not familiar with that particular platform. I don't know.
I'm not familiar with that particular tool, but I do know that especially when dealing with data that are collected for clinical trials, you want to be especially careful what tools you're submitting these data to. You don't want to you want to really scrutinize their privacy agreements and things like that, because again, it could go into a large public repository and be available. So I think you need, if you're a member of an organization, I'm sure there are higher level lawyers and IT people that would scrutinize that for you and really determine if it was something that is a usable tool for your purposes and that would not risk your study population.
I will add that for our IRB regulations, any kind of technology that comes in touch with your data is scrutinized pretty closely to see who has access to it and what elements of it are being used. So when in doubt about a particular tool you want to use for your data, reach out to your IRB office and see how you should be thinking through that process.
Yeah, and I will say, because I don't actually use too many tools when I'm de-identifying data, I do it more kind of as a homegrown, let's talk through it and how do we want to manipulate it. If there are tools out there that work really well for this, one, I'm not quite sure what they are and I don't have experience, but if we have more people using them regularly and can start showing that they are helpful, that they do work, I think that's how you gain acceptance. But I'm not sure, to me, I would say a tool by itself is just that, a tool. It's not going to do the whole thing for you. So it's got to be a mixture of both things.
Excellent. So I'll move on to the next question. So third question from the audience is that safe harbor de-identification reduces the utility of a data set is an argument not widely accepted other than experts of the expert determination-based de-identification. Geographical and date-related limitations / redaction requirement can be waived if necessary using the limited data set standard. What method has each of the panelists used, and did they consider the alternate method? Why or why not?
This one's hard. I think one thing we're not talking too much about today, but is worth consideration, is where are you putting this data? So if you're going to just throw it out on the internet for any and all to see, you're going to have to be really, really, really careful. If it's got password protected access, different user controls. You have to submit a proposal. You might be able to share slightly more information because of some of those safeguards. So I think it depends on, you know, what the context is a little bit, but I typically just give them the bare minimum that they want for the actual data set that I'm submitting, and then people can reach out to us on a case-by-case basis if there's a specific variable or something that they really feel like they need access to, and we kind of talk about it as a study team.
Any additional comments on that question? All right, let's move on to the next question. Are there common data points that show up in social media accounts like Facebook or Twitter to watch for or be aware of?
I'm sure there are. But I have not worked with social media data as part of my research, but would say that most people that put stuff on Facebook probably know that it's possible to find. Now, how could we link that back to social media? That's a nice question, but it's just not out of my area.
Also not out of my area, but I mean, I think almost everybody has their birth date on one or the other or both. So that's something that can probably easily be linked.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Next question is, if you received a data set that only identifies people with a random subject number, and this data set doesn't contain any of the 18 identifiers, would you consider this data set de-identified?
I guess the things that come to mind is how big is this data set, and do I know where it was collected? Like, do I know it's a data set of 18 people collected in a small town in a particular state? That would worry me. Qualitative data, for example, you know, you'd only have a study ID number and those identifiers are in there, but there's a lot of richness and detail in there as you're reading through the transcripts. I wouldn't consider that de-identified if it's identifiable. I'm not sure if these are the kinds of things that you were thinking about when you were asking this question.
I think it also depends on kind of what data elements were collected in the data set. Is it something that you're looking at a pretty rare thing, or is it pretty common? If it's rare and, you know, like 5 people in there have it, you can probably link that back even without 18 of the main identifiers.
I see a really good question popping up in the chat. And this question asks, for dates, would you ever suggest including only year for some seminal event for a study? For example, enrollment in the trial or date of surgery, and then give a relative time to that initial time point? Or, and then this person continues on, says, like, is there another way that we can keep some salient date info, but not have specific dates?
I'll jump in and say that I think it's an excellent thing. It puts a heavy burden on your statistical team to do that well and make sure that no errors crop up. But I think that's if you have the time and resources to do it, that is a great way to maintain some richness, but still obscuring the identifiable information.
Yeah, so we often will share data sets as the time from surgery, time from diagnosis, time from registration, but don't give the actual dates themselves. But if there is something important like occurred during the pandemic, I guess again, the question there would be, do we really care that it's 2021 versus 2020? Or like, what about it? I think, if you gave a year and the relative time, that's probably not identifying, but I'm not quite sure what people would do with it without more context of the actual study. Like the study team, that might be helpful for, but somebody just using the data out there in the world, I'm not sure if they would have that granular understanding to do all of that, given the context of how it was collected or whatever. But we do like to do relative times and get away from dates altogether.
Yeah, same. A lot of the time for the NRN, we'll do days of life rather than, so we don't give the birth date, but when did this event occur on this infant's day? How many days old was the infant, rather than giving specific dates.
Next question. Who should be doing the de-identification, particularly for safe harbor method? I believe my institution has a policy that says the PI cannot de-identify for their own use or sharing.
So here, typically, it's not the PI or the lead statistician or anyone who was really involved in collecting or analyzing the data while the study was going on. It's somebody that's kind of independent of all that, but that person does work with the PI and the statistician to de-identify the data. So yeah, usually it's someone that's a little bit removed that can be objective to de-identify.
I do want to add that this is then, of course, a big challenge for small environments and low resource environments where you can't just say, can you do this for me? I'm going to do it for your study. That makes it very challenging.
Yeah, this kind of falls under the same idea as having a data safety monitoring statistician that's blinded, that does all your work. Usually that happens in larger studies with more funding and more personnel effort. So you might be limited a bit if this is a tiny study and you just don't have the people and the time.
Because I think the important part is that it's still a skilled person who's familiar, who's not going to forget an extremely important variable that's highly identifiable. So, which is why I really liked Emily S's points that yes, it's a different person, but they certainly do talk to the senior statistician and the PI to make sure that the result is what it needs to be.
Excellent, excellent. So the next question is, have you any experience using synthetic data? I heard about a company in Israel that gets by creating synthetic data.
I do not know what synthetic data is.
Nope.
I've heard of it, but I've never used it.
Y'all are just ahead of the game, whoever's asking those questions. I really can't speak to it.
So RTI has a group that does synthetic population. I'm not familiar with their work, so I'm just going to plead ignorance to that question as well. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Are there any gaps in the de-identification process that would make downstream data aggregation and query challenging based on the tools and submission processes chosen across collaborative data cohorts where there aren't harmonized methods during collaboration?
Yeah, there's lots of gaps, so many gaps. So if you're going to work together and actually aggregate across studies, that has to be a collaborative thing from day one or it fails. And even when it is a collaborative thing from day one, I feel like it often fails or trips up quite a lot because it's just really difficult to have the same measures, the same approach, the same way it was collected. And it's just really challenging. So I think, I'm not saying you can't aggregate across data because I do think that's the goal at the end of the day. But if that really is your goal, then that needs to be discussed up front and have very standard approaches to how we're going to enter days of life, days of event. If somebody gives me a mutated date and you give me days, I can't sync those in the same way that if we just didn't do it all the same way up front. So it would be a very big challenge.
And building on that, using common data elements, for example, for pain, we have demographic forms where we're using the same way in which we assess gender and sexual orientation and so forth. Like using that is going to be wonderful for later on aggregating across data sets. So whenever possible, when there is a standard, even for something like demographics, please use it.
Yes.
And I would even say, even if you did use the common data elements, when you're de-identifying, sometimes you collapse categories and they might not get collapsed in the same way. So that's another hiccup in that process.
It's fun. Yeah, if you're doing scales or different, questions, it's best to give me all the information as long as it's not identifying. And then you can choose to collapse the end. But if you give anything collapsed in the middle, there's no way to tease that back out. So, yeah.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Do you share text data after de-identification? How do you approach to the associated data use agreement for sharing de-identified text?
I'm assuming you don't mean like text box where it's very short, brief answers and you refer more towards a longer transcript of something. And there, I've never personally shared any transcripts outside of my team, but I wonder if that excellent link that Steve shared at the beginning for qualitative data, if they have some guidance there to think through.
Yeah, I'm not a qualitative researcher, but I know that that's something that's, I would view this question very much like a qualitative transcript. So whatever, it goes back to what I said at the very beginning, like go look at what the qualitative standards are in terms of how people submit data out there and start there. That would be my suggestion.
And also probably before you hand it out, like you usually would code the data anywhere, like for instance, like symptoms and so forth. There's usually medical coders who put it into particular categories. So that kind of coding of the data would already be done. So you would never have to share the codes that came before the raw entry. You would then use the expert coded variables that come out of it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we are getting near the top of the hour. And so this will be our last question. If you collect data today, will there be a time in the future when de-identification does not matter?
I sincerely hope not. I hope we will always protect privacy of folks.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think it has to matter. So I don't know if there's like, if you die, then your data can be out there, but I don't think so. Pretty sure that's not a thing.
I think even then with all like the genetic information that's out there, it could link to somebody that is alive. So it need to matter.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all so much to who participated in this webinar today. I want to give a special shout out to the audience for providing us many resources and links for synthetic data. You may be hearing from the stewards at a time in the future, since synthetic data seems to be a pretty hot topic. So a special thank you to our presenter, Steve Erickson, and our panelists, Emily Dressler, Bettina Hoeppner, and Emily Smith. We are very grateful for your insights into de-identifying HEAL data. For the audience, we hope that you're leaving with a better understanding of data de-identification and an increased motivation to properly prepare and share your data for to further enhance the HEAL platform. In addition to a recording of this webinar, we will also email everyone who is registered for this event a list of resources, including the links that were shared today, and the slide deck. We hope that these items will help you participate more deeply in the HEAL ecosystem. There will also be a link to our Slack channel and connect with us form located soon in the chat box. We hope that you will reach out to us, the HEAL Data Stewards, for questions or support as you embark on your FAIR journey to maximize the value of HEAL data. And finally, we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar on July 21st from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. During this webinar, we will be introducing and discussing common data elements. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.